Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you. Thank you for coming back. Tonight, I'm going to share my screen. Tonight, see, I already went to the wrong button. All right. So tonight we're going to look at hopefully some less theoretical things, but we may indulge in a little more theory. Firstly, thank you for all of your emails, keeping me on my toes. You ask really wonderful questions. And yeah, I agree that there's a certain irony that I am teaching a course on dialogue in the least dialogical way. So with that in mind, I'm not teaching us or even would know how to teach to be in a dialogical encounter, but I do know that this venue is probably not the place that we're going to do it. However, we're going to look at some really interesting ideas tonight. So last week we looked at the many ways into dialogue, and hopefully you were at least able to process a number of those ways. Tonight we're going to talk about what it means to have dialogue as liberation. So the question you might be asking is liberation from what? And so some of the thinkers that we're going to look at tonight are going to show us what is keeping us shackled and how dialogue, the encounter of dialogue can liberate us. And then in the third class, we'll sort of veer to the political, that our ability to encounter one another in dialogue can be perceived as a form of resistance. So tonight, we're going to have I'm going to go through a few takeaways from last meeting so that we're on the same page. Hopefully you had some time to process everything and look at the most recent email. And then I'm going to give you a few takeaways for tonight's meeting so that if you get lost in any of the analysis or the interpretation, at least you can go back and know what you should be taking away from this meeting. And then I'm going to start with a few quotes from a very well-known revolutionary, Rosa Luxemburg, and her work, Reform and Revolution. I'll talk a little bit about her, not too much, just to set the stage of what it means to think in a revolutionary manner. And then we will look at the video I sent, or the music of Bob Marley and his rendition of Haile Selassie's 1963 speech to the UN. And what does it mean that he says everywhere is war? Then we will move to Martin Buber, where everywhere is the possibility of peace, not as an antithesis to Marley and Selassie, but showing that possibilities should include all avenues. And I will say that I gave myself 10 minutes to talk about Martin Buber. And the last time I did that, when it was in a contrived setting for that I Thou video, it still was 11 minutes. So I'm hopeful that I can keep Buber within 10 minutes, but I can't make any promises. We're going to have a breakout room. And so I have a question for all of you to discuss. And then we're going to get to the dialogue as liberation. And so another fairly well-known thinker, Paulo Freire, a Brazilian thinker. And interestingly, when I bring his name up, sometimes people don't know who I'm talking about, but I have a sense that a lot of you may have heard of him. He is the third most cited person in humanities, meaning that if you've written a book or an article in the humanities, you've probably cited him in some capacity, both positively and negatively. People have very strong views about his ideas, both positively and negatively. And so we'll look at them. And then dialogue is a new way of thinking. So this is where we'll start to take the theoretical and try to apply it. So how can we practically be liberated, and from what? And David Bohm will help us. And then we'll have parting thoughts, and then we'll call it an evening. Good. So a few takeaways from last week. We need to know that the dialogue is not a universally accepted or understood term. So as I was saying before, at last meeting, people use it in a variety of ways. And so it's important that if you want to engage in a more controlled environment that is dialogical, you need to set out what you think dialogue is and agree to what that might mean. The way that we're going to talk about it tonight is less contrived and more based in encounter. But we need to understand that it's not a universally accepted or understood term. Another thing that we take away from last class is that the thinkers that we're grappling with here talk about how we've built walls, both architecturally and existentially, with the intent to dehumanize other people. So just to revisit that, so the basic premise is we're born into the world as a human being, and that there's the possibility of freedom in that entering the world. But as you live in the world and as you encounter other people, your world and your ability to navigate in the world becomes more narrow, right? You live in a particular language. You are inundated with certain narratives, maybe a national identity, maybe a religious identity, and that more and more our ability to be self-determined, or the ability to think beyond the sort of narratives that contain us become more and more limited. And since we live in a world that is highly contentious, rather than live in a critical consciousness where we're constantly examining why we are conditioned in this way and why couldn't we be conditioned in another way, and thinking about Al-Ghazali last week, rather than question our world, we sustain and embolden it and strengthen these walls through propaganda and ideology. And so one thing that we're going to look at tonight is that part of the problem when we think dialogically in difference and how people live and think differently, very often we think we're the ones that are not affected by ideology, that we have ideas and the others are simply conditioned by things that are beyond their control, that we see their propaganda and ideology, and that it's our goal to open them up to those problems without considering our own situation, both existentially and politically. And that these walls perpetuate hierarchies, political, economic, and social, that reduce the possibilities of dialogical encounter. So again, we're going to be talking about like revolutionaries tonight. So they think in terms of hierarchies, that there are political, economic, and social hierarchies. And when they talk about the word oppressed, they're going to use that in a variety of settings. And David Bohm is an interesting example, because what David Bohm is going to teach is that these hierarchies are they're even embedded in how we parent. An example that he gives is that, like, what if you have a rebellious teenager? I have two teenagers, so this resonated with me a little bit. How do you make their behavior less destructive, less aggressive, less angry? Do you take away something that's meaningful to them, to punish them, to know that their actions have consequences? Or do you hope that they don't make the same mistakes by showing some charity, right? And so what Bohm says is that just in our very relationships, we have conditions of hierarchy, right? As a parent, you can't do that because I said so. You're living under my roof. These are the rules. That we're conditioning people to look at authority and power in a certain way, and that gets reified and reinforced in schools. And that's what Paulo Freire is going to argue, that you have teachers that require you to memorize information and regurgitate it to them, and that your ability to succeed is really your ability to please a system that is already politically constructed. And so when they talk about what it means to liberate, they want to liberate beyond all of those things. They think there's something else, and that dialogue, that when you encounter a human being without all of those things and have a self-critical consciousness where you can enter into a relationship with a person without justifying those narratives, without having the impulse to defend yourself, but rather allowing that person's worldview to inform yours and to put both under the microscope is where you get glimpses of what it means to be free. We live in a world of perpetual conflict, so our identities are formed in these conditions. So rather than ask questions of our others or our enemies and trying to understand a certain point of view, we strengthen the armor that makes our identity. We return to our narratives, we return to our worldviews, and we strengthen them as a way of protecting. And what some of these thinkers want to do is ask deeper questions. What if we didn't? What if you simply tried to learn a point of view that was at odds with your own? And the fact that we're still capable of dialogue or the dialogical encounter for all of these thinkers proves that this doesn't have to be the way. This doesn't have to be the world that we live in, and they want to imagine and live in another. And so tonight's meeting, we're going to explore this idea. So, takeaways for tonight. When these thinkers talk about dialogue, they're not talking about merely a conversation. It's not the sharing of different perspectives or even a negotiation. It's transformative and even the possibility of a transcendent experience. So when you let go of who you think you are and the narratives that inform your identity, and both people do that in an encounter, these thinkers, especially Buber, are going to entertain something transcendent, but that you come out of that encounter transformed. And that means that whatever differences you bring into them, you'll bring them out of the encounter, but those differences will be understood differently. So it's not utopian in the sense that you come around to agreeing. You have a more nuanced and empathetic view of that difference. Our orientation to dialogue requests an openness to uncertainty. So this critical consciousness, meaning that the more you engage in dialogue, the more you are open to what you don't know. And the more you become open to the fact that you were conditioned in the same way that your interlocutor was. And that this shared pursuit to try to understand where our narratives come from and why they're important to us, you don't have to dismiss them. You just simply need to analyze them. And analyzing them together in difference creates the conditions for this type of transformation. And that dialogue can teach us how we can be religious and political while also being vulnerable and full of doubts. And this is the key thing that I'm hoping that we can take away from tonight. When you're living in a polarized sphere and you feel that your religion or your politics are under attack, you withdraw and you become defensive. You become emotional and angry, and you see those threats everywhere. You're constantly on the lookout, and what the possibility for dialogue teaches us is that when we enter vulnerable, knowing that our point of view could actually be offensive and deeply problematic for someone else, even violent, right? So one of the things that Buber teaches is that when we attach ourselves to certain narratives, especially when it comes to nation states, and we won't really talk about it this much, but this is a footnote, you invariably attach yourself to a form of state-sanctioned violence, right? That your identity becomes, in some ways, a justification for violence. To be that person and attached to this national identity means that violence is a means for liberation. And that makes it very difficult in a dialogical encounter when you hold on to identities that are violent to other people. We'll save that for another class, but just to keep that in mind, this is something that they're trying to work through. So let's talk about liberation and dialogue. So, as I said, Rosa Luxemburg is a very well-known revolutionary. She's a Polish-born Jew who moves to Germany and gets very involved in revolutionary politics. She becomes one of the first women in all of Europe to get a PhD from the University of Zurich in political economy and law. She's a writer, she is an organizer, and she really makes her name in anti-war efforts in founding a society called the Spartacus League. And she's very involved in challenging authority, both from the state and from the home. And she became famous, and I didn't actually put this quote in the PowerPoint, but I wrote it down because it occurred to me a few minutes before we were doing the class. She is famous for her anti-Bolshevism, right? She is very involved in some of the socialist movements, but she's against the dogmatic view of socialism. And she is very anti-Bolshevik because she feared a totalitarian revolution is going to stand in the way of our full capacity for freedom. And her quote is, freedom is always the freedom of the dissenter, right? So that to live in a truly free society is to share the same freedoms as those who dissent within that society. What I want to do tonight is I lifted 4 quotes from her book, Reform and Revolution. And these 4 quotes are going to serve as the catalyst for the 4 different parts of our course tonight. Excuse me. So the first quote is, the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. So I think Bob Marley's song and how he takes Haile Selassie's UN speech and creates this revolutionary tactic is a good way of looking at what she means by this. The second quote is, freedom is always and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently. So I reserve this quote for Martin Buber. I think that while he's not always perceived as a revolutionary, I think that he allows us in terms of our dialogical work and our theology to consider things with a broader view of what it means to be free. The third is, history is the only true teacher. The revolution is the best school. I feel this will summarize the work of Paulo Freire in the third part, so after your breakout room. And then finally, those who do not move do not notice their chains. And so I think that what David Bohm is going to offer is a way for us to see what we're shackled by, and what his solution is. So this will end the class tonight with some of his solutions and how he thinks that we can move society forward dialogically. So let's look at the first phrase. The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. So I think you know that this is not a pipe. This is a very, so Magrette's famous painting, right? So Everywhere is War, Bob Marley and Haile Selassie. So hopefully you had a chance to listen to the song. It's only about 3 minutes. My guess is that because I find it a very good song. I probably listened to it more than once today. He is taking an excerpt of Haile Selassie's speech about discrimination, and he is saying that as long as we live in a world where the constructs of race and power play a role, as long as the legacies of colonialism and racism are not addressed, as long as people still live under the foot of oppression from colonists and other oppressors, you can never say the world is at peace. We're always at war. Until the conditions of that war disappear, you should always live as if you are fighting in a war. And so for them, or more particularly Haile Selassie, a process has to change in both those who are affected and oppressed by the legacies of colonialism. There has to be a consciousness change, as well as for those who are the oppressors who don't even see themselves as such, right? So people who drive in cars don't think about the Belgian ravishing of Africa and the genocidal methods it took to take their rubber, right? So there has to be a change in consciousness globally for this war to end. And so that the violence that comes in this war is only just flashpoints. So they are loudly proclaiming what's happening. We are living in a world that's perpetually at war. And until all of us address that we are at war, we're never going to see peace or live in peace. And so as long as there's racism, bigotry, sexism, homophobia, or any prejudice, we will be at war. And so this is very reminiscent of Daryl Davis, right? He's saying that we live in an environment where the ground is already fertile for violence. And so his position, as long as we're talking, doesn't mean that we're not at war, we're not fighting. And so for him, it's the issue of violence that he's addressing. And that we're shackled, even dehumanized by our own prejudice and hatred. We dehumanize ourselves through prejudice. And like in the Passover Haggadah, we're not free until everyone is free. And the reason why I brought the Passover Haggadah is that I do think that there is a part of the Haggadah that is very helpful in understanding this worldview. So in Jewish tradition, and in other religious traditions in various ways, there's this idea that you love the ger, the stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt, right? And that on Passover, you both remind yourselves that you were enslaved, but you also remind yourselves that you're not entirely free until slavery is eradicated. And so until the world is redeemed, until there is no more oppression, we can never really be free. And an interesting midrash or interpretation of this is that the word ger, stranger, we see that actually before the exodus of Egypt in the name Hagar, one of Abraham's wives, an Egyptian, who Sarah oppresses. Hagar is literally the ger, and we have the situation where you have an Israelite, a matriarch, oppressing an Egyptian who is literally the stranger. And the stranger is the only one, Hagar, that gets to name God in the Hebrew Bible and gets to name God El Roi, the God who sees me, that God sees those who are oppressed. And the teaching is that while we live in a world where there are oppressors and oppressed, that pendulum can switch very quickly. As long as we live in a dialectical world in which there needs to be an oppressor and needs to be someone oppressed, it doesn't mean that people are eternally oppressed or eternally the oppressor. It can switch, sadly, very, very quickly. And so we have to step out of this narrative that the Passover Haggadah teaches us as a way of liberating ourselves from it, right? That in order for me to be free, that doesn't mean that someone else needs to be oppressed or enslaved. So there is this move then from the communal to the individual. And I'm sharing a German Jewish thinker named Walter Benjamin, because he had a very interesting idea, and he's running at the time of Rosa Luxemburg, that, after the 19th century, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, there was a fear that people were becoming less religious because with technology, it took away the awe of nature. There was a dominating of nature, and there was this hubristic idea that through science, we can know everything, and that the awe that religion created, that distance between the infinite and the finite, was shrinking. And so a sociologist, Max Weber, talked about how religious traditions were becoming less effective in the modern world based on technology, that people's capacity to be controlled by religion or be in awe of religion changed. Benjamin argues something different. He said, rather than it changing, the awe that we have and the authority that we bestow on others went from religion, and for him it went to capitalism, to an economic system. Because for him, the sort of awe and majesty that we hold to religion as a system that explains the world, that creates morality, that is justified, is a good explanation as to why good things happen to good people and why bad things happen to bad people. He saw that this impulse could easily be mapped onto this economic system. And so you have like economists for him that become the clerisy of prophets. They can determine the rise and fall of our new natural environment. Business leaders become the priests. So because this economic system is natural and the best form, only the best people will succeed in it. They're rewarded because they deserve it. And so business leaders get bestowed the transcendent wisdom that we once reserved for priests. They know what's best. We need to listen to them. Advertising, right? So artistic expression becomes a way of persuading people in a different direction. Public relations and iconography, right? So capitalism becomes this way that we change the way that images function in everyday society. So like think of the Mona Lisa for a second. You know, before photography, you would have to literally go and see it in person to have any sense of what it is. And so the sort of awe of seeing that object in relation to you, and remember what I was talking with Hans-Georg Gadamer last week, having a dialogical encounter with this thing that moves you, this creative art. With the rise of technology, it can be commodified in such a way that it takes away that awe. Right? You can literally have a Mona Lisa on your refrigerator. It no longer becomes a sacred thing, and it becomes something that is the modus operandi of both authoritarianism and democracy, the contradicting aspects of it. Because for those who don't have access to see this artwork, they now do. But then the awe that goes with that artwork becomes an aura. It disappears. And then there's a political theology. Life is understood as the natural outcome of some human behavior to the point where social and economic hierarchies are perceived as natural and moral. If you're rich, you deserve to be rich. If you're poor, you deserve to be poor. It's this beautiful understanding of the world that seems to be natural. It makes sense. And we don't have to think about it. And the best part about this theology is if I can't explain to you why this is moral, just understand that there's an invisible hand that is moving us to a better society by having this economic system in place. And so for Benjamin, this operated in a way that created such a strong individualism that our capacity to engage other people became commodified. We became individualistic to the point where we almost no longer needed a sense of community. And it became a more hierarchical and competitive atmosphere as an extension of nature. So freedom is always and exclusively freedom for the one who thinks differently. And so this is where I'm going to get to Martin Buber. And I'm going to do Martin Buber relatively quickly for the sake of time, and also because you saw that video, the 11-minute video. And I promised that I wouldn't shill from ICJS programs, but I guess I misspoke, or I lied. We have on our website a six-class course on Martin Buber that I taught several years ago. That we covered everything. No, I'm kidding. We didn't cover everything, but we covered 6 hours worth of stuff. And so if you have time and want to learn more Buber, you can go check it out. So why Buber? Why now? Well, Martin Buber is both an iconoclastic and a popular figure in our imaginations. So I'm sharing a picture of him in Heppenheim, a drawing of a young Buber, artist renditions of Buber, the commodification of Buber, as we see there in a sticker, and then the ultimate commodification, Justin Buber or Martin Bieber. So it's I don't know if you know who Justin Bieber is. I was proud at one point that I knew who he was because of my teenagers. He's a pop star, and now he's Martin Buber. So I just want to quickly go through this one quote with you before we go to our breakout rooms. The human world today is never before split into two camps, each of which understands the other as the embodiment of falsehood and itself the embodiment of truth. So very similar to what we've been discussing already. Often in history, to be sure, national groups and religious associations have stood in so radical an opposition that one side denied and condemned the other in its innermost existence, right? In order to be me means that I am not you and never want to have any association with you. Anthropologists call that schismogenesis, in that in order for me to be me, I can't have anything in common with you. And we see this sociologically, like when we talk about red states and blue states, for instance, right? That you go to the most radical extreme of your identity so that you would never be confused with the other. It's in our innermost existence. Now, however, it is the human population of our planet generally that is so divided, and with rare exceptions, this division is everywhere, seems as a necessity of existence in this world hour, right? So for Buber in 1952, and hopefully you're getting a sense of what he might be referring to in 1952, this world is so polarized that we need to base our identity on a relationship to one side or the other in this polarization, right? That there's polarization, you need to choose a side or you're morally compromised, right? It's impossible to find a middle way. And so he who makes himself an exception is suspected or ridiculed by both sides, right? You have no moral compass. You either choose the side of good or the side of evil. Each assumed a monopoly on the sunlight and has plunged its antagonists into night. And each side demands that you decide between day and night. So he's talking about the rise of communism, and that this the fear of communism, both within communist societies and outside, created the conditions that were no longer dialogical. You were either for or against communism, and you were going to be suspicious of anyone that either supported in some way or against it in some way, depending where you stood in communism. And he saw this as an existential issue. So I'm going to jump ahead from this slide and just rather than analyze those parts. He says what we need to do is we need to sacrifice our ego in order to create space for others. And what he means something very specific by this. Sacrifice takes place in the world of space. And he's trying to imagine what it would look like dialogically to be with an interlocutor that has nothing in common with you. And he notes in his German translation of the Hebrew Bible that the Hebrew word korban, which we usually translate as sacrifice, comes from the word mekerev, to draw close, karov, closeness, that a sacrifice is drawing close to something. So if you sacrifice something, you're allowing yourself to be in space closer to something else. And for Buber, the sacrifice draws us close to God. The reason why we have a korban, it's a way of letting ourselves go, letting the sense of who we are and how we have control in the world, and allowing a place for God to enter us, right? That God is the infinite, we're the finite. We need to create some way that be a vessel and draw us closer to God. And for Buber, a sacrifice in the Bible is what did that. A korban is a ritual that takes place in the world of I-it. And the reason why I sent off the video about I-it and I-thou is that we don't have time tonight to go through all the different ins and outs of what an I-it, I-thou relationship is, but it's the objectification of that. So it would create, the ritual itself becomes an object. And in dialogue, a korban is a moment of mutuality requiring you to sacrifice part of your ego, part of what you know, in order to draw close to your interlocutor or the other. So if you actually have a physical object that you're sacrificing and letting it go, it's not drawing you close to anything because you're in a relationship between you as a subject and that as an object. But what Buber is saying is that a korban in between two people, and you both sacrifice part of who you are to allow that other person a glimpse of your own vulnerabilities, to be vulnerable together, you're going to draw close to one another. You're going to have a sense of the other despite your differences, even if they're irreconcilable. And that sacrificing part of yourself draws you both closer to God. That in this moment, and this is where Buber is the theologian, is essential to a meeting with God. And the second part of this is that he has an interpretation of Leviticus 19:18 of loving the neighbor, v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, to love the neighbor as yourself, is that it's been mistranslated in the sense that we think in terms of I, it, or even in commodification of putting ourselves at the center. Buber says this misreading comes when people interpret as loving the neighbor in the same way as you love yourself, right? So it puts you at the center. And that becomes the problem because you're not sacrificing, you're not in the korban. You're imposing your understanding of love onto your neighbor, right? And this is a problem in all dialogical settings. We don't all have the same notions of what these words mean. Love is probably one of the more complicated ones because the word itself is always contextual, right? I love my wife. I love my kids. Most of the time I love my pets. I love, I don't know, certain books. But if that verb meant the same thing in each context, you'd think I was a sociopath, right? Like that would be really gross if I loved my parents in the same way that I loved my mother, or if I love my mother in the same way that I love my kids or my pet or my wife, right? We understand that it happens in a context. But if I impose an understanding of love onto someone else, for Buber, we're not actually creating a space of dialogue. The risk is people that can lose sight that neighbor is different and unique person. You need to focus on that person and not yourself. That person can be seen as a reflection of our own self-conception, right? We are just continually reifying our own prejudices if we're constantly thinking of ourselves when we're thinking about love. And so we have to reorient ourselves, our I, for the sake of community. So instead, the phrase should be translated, you shall love your neighbor, he, she, or they is like you. So they're like you in the sense that your love for that person is directed at that person and not at yourself. And it's a recognition that the neighbor is not the same as you, but is capable of love like you, whatever that love would be, and that there's equal mutuality in this relationship. So the I, thou, the I, you recognizes the uniqueness and distinctiveness of the other. You are a complicated person that's informed by many different ideas, and you have a way in which you orient to the world that's unique to yourself. And when two people share an encounter where both of those forms of uniqueness and distinctiveness are laid bare, there's equal mutuality. And it's taking away a potential of a hierarchy in that relationship. It helps you move away from your egoistic conception of self, right? So if I'm no longer using the narratives that inform me to defend my point of view, and that in an encounter, I'm examining a point of view that comes from me in the same way that I'm doing for someone else, there's a certain liberatory aspect in that all of us are learning something from one another without us actually having to hold on to me. And you sacrifice part of yourself in order to enter into dialogue. So it's a conditioning. How much of you do you really want to be? And how much do you want your interlocutor to play a role in who you want to become? And so the I, you, and the I and the you uphold the distinctiveness of the other in the need of respect and love. And the community for Buber is built on this mutual recognition. You can be in community with people who are vastly different from one another. But if you see every single person as someone who you have the possibility for this mutual recognition or dialogical encounter, that every encounter with a person both similar and different is a possibility to engage dialogically, you're going to relate to your neighbor very differently, right? And I'm using just contemporary politics, but because I'm in Baltimore, this is the world that I live in. But if someone has a Trump sign in front of their house, and this is a city that is 90% voting Democratic, rather than demonize the person with the sign in front of their house, I have to engage that person as if I can have a dialogical encounter with them in the same way that I can with the people in my own political community. And that means that I will ask better questions of that person, and I will give them dignity and respect in the way that Daryl Davis did, right? And that's where it becomes transformational. And that's why it's revolutionary, because it's asking you to do something that's against your own intuitions. Initially, these are conditioned intuitions, that he would argue. Community is built then on an openness to sacrifice one's I. And again, think about Al-Ghazali last week. There's so much that goes into what we say who we are and our identities and everything else that's conditional, it's ephemeral, it's inherited. Where is your self-determinism in all of that? When you let go of it for Buber, it doesn't mean that all of those things become less relevant, but you become more open to someone else's narrative in a way that's going to inform your own. Okay. I know that was a lot, but now it's your turn to chat. So again, in the Zoom room, please share your name and where you're zooming in from, and one recent dialogical encounter. And we're going to keep coming back to this. I know that this is not an intuitive dialogical space, but now that you're starting to learn the tools and the language around this, maybe you can reinterpret some of your relationships or encounters. And if you feel comfortable, you can share it. If you don't feel compelled. And then I want you to discuss the following question. What do you think of Buber's approach to dialogue in our current political moment? What do you think it means to sacrifice your ego? So, given the limited information that you've been given about Buber, do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? And what do you think it means? And so you'll do that for 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and do part 2. I was going to say, sound good, but I know that you can't respond. So, sound good? Great. Good. So, see you soon. Real quickly, before we move into the next part, there was a question in the chat, and I didn't see it until now. And so I wanted to answer the question. It was a really good question. So in the Hebrew Bible, the loving the neighbor as yourself, v'ahavta recha kamocha. The question was, is it gendered? Is the neighbor a he or a she? Like who is this being referred to? The grammar is actually pretty clear here. It's speaking to you as a man. So Hebrew is a gendered language. When you say you, if you're speaking to a man, you use a particular form of you, and if you're speaking to a woman, a particular form of you in biblical Hebrew. Modern Hebrew is trying to change that a little bit. So it's you. Speaking to a man, will love the neighbor as yourself, and the neighbor is genderless. And so when you have he, she, they for Buber, and Buber wouldn't have said he, she, they. This is more a contemporary gloss on it. The neighbor is whoever is in relationship to you. The neighbor, even the gender of the neighbor is irrelevant for Buber and really for any commentator thinking about the neighbor, but the language itself is actually quite gendered. The you is a man, and that's taken to mean that it's speaking to all of us as speaking to a man. But the Hebrew Bible doesn't always say what people want it to say. I think in terms of trying to, the tension between exegesis, what you bring out of the text, and eisegesis, what you put in. There's always a struggle on how you think about that. Okay. We're going to go to the third part. History is the only true teacher. The revolution is the best school. So this is the third quote from Luxemburg. And we're going to move to Paulo Freire, who I just think in terms of dialogical settings and interreligious dialogue, his work is, while not often cited in that setting, despite the fact that he's very widely cited, people probably should be reading him a little bit more. Just as a really brief background on him, he grew up impoverished in Brazil. That experience itself informed really the rest of his life, both in activism, philosophy, and pedagogy. He remembers that he was so hungry that he couldn't focus on anything other than his hunger, and that it impacted the way that he was able to perform in school, which wasn't very well. And so he became an advocate for literacy for the poor in Brazil. And he did a lot of work in trying to create a more equitable education system in Brazil until 1964 in the coup d'etat with the junta. He was then perceived as a traitor for his political beliefs, and he was imprisoned. And when he came out of prison, he moved into exile, went to Bolivia and then to Chile. And during that time, he started to think about his life as a philosopher. He had studied philosophy, he had a background in philosophy, and he combined his philosophical and his pedagogical interests into a form of political activism. And he started writing. And in 1969, he wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which we're going to analyze tonight. That it drove him to worldwide acclaim. It was translated into English and in Spanish, and it afforded him the opportunity to be a visiting professor at Harvard the following year, which then brought him to Europe to pursue his intellectual and philosophical pursuits until he was allowed to return to Brazil much later. Freire is very interesting in that he's going to take Buber, and Buber imagined himself as not being invested always in the explicit political realm, and he's going to understand the I and thou and I it relationship far more politically, and he's going to apply it both to pedagogy and to politics. So he argues that education in general can't be divorced from politics, that education is a form of conditioning, and that we have to recognize that the education is creating citizens to participate in a polis in a certain way. The type of history that's taught, the type of language that's taught, the type of respect for authority that comes out of it, and that this project takes away from a certain form of self-determination from students and teachers, and that the acts of teaching and learning are political acts in themselves, that there is simply no neutral element to teaching in terms of content and style for Freire, and that teachers and students must be made aware of the educational politics. The way that students are taught and the way that they are taught serves a political agenda. So like, when you go into a dialogical encounter and you're trying to understand all of the narratives that inform your sense of self, Freire is trying to bring that into a classroom, that we come to a classroom in a certain way under certain conditions, and we simply need to become conscious of those things and what interests they're serving. And that we need to replace what he calls a banking model of education with a dialogical one. The banking model of education, and I regret that I'm doing this very quickly, but it's the basic idea that students are banks and you simply are depositing knowledge in them, and that they take out that knowledge when they want to advance in society. That the best students are the ones that regurgitate and give back to the society what they've been given in the first place. So it creates a more narrow path within the education system. These are caricatures and they're far more nuanced than that. But he wants to imagine what it would be like if we had a more dialogical pedagogy. So what does he mean by that? Dialogue is the encounter between men mediated by the world in order to name the world. And this is important for Freire, to name. There's a certain power in naming. And you go back to the Hebrew Bible with the first human. The first human, Adam, gets to name, and that there's a certain power in naming objects, and that you are empowered when you get to name objects. And just as a gloss on that, historically, when you think of hierarchical or power relations, think of who calls whom, right? Native Americans didn't call themselves Indians. Interestingly, right, Jews in the 19th century didn't say they followed a religion that was imposed on them. That those who get to name things get to have power over them. And he's cognizant of this. And dialogue cannot occur between those who want to name the world and those who do not wish this naming, between those who deny others the right to speak their word and those whose right to speak has been denied to them. Right. So the idea that we live in a society where certain people get to name and control, and others always have to be in reaction to those things, that their identity is always being given to them, and that their identity is always in contrast with a dominant culture. And those who have been denied their primordial right to speak their word must first reclaim this right and prevent the continuation of this dehumanizing aggression. So dialogue is an existential necessity. And so what he means is that you create a space where the dialogical encounter is more real, right? So for instance, I'm speaking English and this is being conducted in English. Historically, this probably would not have been the language that my family would have spoken, but in certain conditions, but the way that they chose to be in this. There are many others that didn't. And so that English is imposed on them, and that the English identity is imposed on them, and that their identity in terms of how we engage one another has been taken away. And it's a dehumanizing, what he sees, an aggression. And Freire uses these really stark terms, right? Oppression, aggression. But we're going to find that it's not always in terms of physical violence. So there are four anti-dialogical approaches to life and politics for Freire that make up the way we live in our educational life and system. So conquest, right? So part of an education story is to narrate our victories. We're here because we won. We're here because this was the natural course of things. The more, the arc of history has led us here, and the immutable truth of history has put us where we are. And so the vanquished, the conquered, are still in the classroom with those who conquered it. And then divide and rule. So it's important for Freire that when the conquered is conquered, that the rulers create divisions among them so that they don't unite and reclaim their self-determination together, right? And he talks about racism, classism, all of those things as a way of dividing. And we have to be clear that he's not creating a conspiracy theory in the sense that there's some puppet master doing all of these things. What he's talking about is a society in which my self-determination as one that has benefited from the conquest, I don't really think about in terms of conquest. In fact, when you bring up the issues, I prefer not to talk about it. And the idea is that those that are in positions of power get to choose what they do and don't care about. If they say that, like, I don't want to talk about these things, you're in a privileged position to make that decision in the first place. Whereas those that are ruled and divided don't have that choice. Manipulation, right? Propaganda, the quest to make people's narratives essential to who they are. And then colonization or cultural invasion. And he uses both of these terms. And so he's also writing in the 1960s, he's responding in some ways to Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, in that the idea of the colonized and the colonizer become this dialectic in which they each fall into their roles as a form of violence. He's suggesting that the colonization is anti-dialogical, and that while for Fanon, he can describe violence as a way out of it, or as a natural order of things, thinking back to Bob Marley and Haile Selassie, right? As long as all of these conditions for hatred, prejudice, and bigotry endure, we will be at war, right? So in a sense of being colonial, it doesn't matter if you're living in peace, you're always at war until those conditions have been addressed. And so he makes a claim to exist humanly is to name the world and to change it. Human beings are not built in silence, but in word and work and action and reflection. So to deny a person the right to speak and to name their world on their terms is to deny their humanity. Right? So you have to create a dialogical space when everyone can speak in a way that is true to themselves and have the opportunity and power to name. Dialogue is not the activity of the powerful or the elite or the educated. It's just a basic human right. We need to be doing this together and creating a space where all people who all live within this system and in his mind are oppressed by it. Even the oppressors for him are oppressed by a certain system that gives them power, because it also denies them their humanity, because it takes away the conditions for an actual dialogical encounter. We're all denying ourselves a basic human right. And he sees education as a way to liberate us from that. And to deny the human right to communicate through dialogue is to reduce men to the status of things, an it. Right? So a human being is a subject, is complicated, is fluid, in flux, and always changing. And it is a static thing. And if we reduce people to things and we objectify them, it makes it very easy for us to continue and perpetuate things like racism, bigotry, sexism, etc. And so anti-dialogical practices turn people into objects, into things. He's using Buber's I-thou philosophy to develop an interpersonal means for cultural communication. And he's trying to build cooperation through dialogical practice. He's not trying to alienate anyone. He's saying that we're all in some ways oppressed by these conditions. And remember, he's in Brazil, and think about the history of Brazil and the colonial legacy of Brazil. He's trying to liberate everyone from that legacy. And that there are three antidotes: cooperations, organization, and critical thinking. So what that means is that he wants to create a society in which, if everyone, like as I was describing before, is seen as the possible interlocutor of an I-thou encounter, then you're less likely to demonize them. You're less likely to judge them. You're less likely to be defensive. And that community organizing can include communities that don't always see your liberation as part of their own. When he talks about critical thinking, he's talking about a critical consciousness. And a good way to think about this is not that we need to activate critical thinking. He's thinking about it in terms of a verb. We need to be in some sort of critical thinking moment. And there's an analog to Erich Fromm, or Erich Fromm, someone that he read and cited, that the problem with the phrase falling in love is that you think love is a passive condition. You fall into it rather than you are actively animated by it. That you don't fall in and out of love. Once you've experienced love, you do the work to maintain that relationship based on this mutual commitment that you have found in love. And he sees that as an analog with critical thinking, right? It's a constant practice. When I think in terms of Jewish tradition, if I'm putting on my Jewish scholar hat, there's a word in Hebrew that means several things simultaneously that I think would have appealed to Ferrari, which is the word avodah, la'avod. Avodah means work, like physical work, or vocational work. Avodah also means service, like to be in service to something. Avodah is also part of the liturgy. It's prayer. That prayer, service, and work are inexorably related to the same fate. For him, critical thinking and love function similarly. They are all three things simultaneously. And that when you recognize that, and that you're in service to others, you work with others as a form of prayer, what ends up happening is that those boundaries that have been built to separate you slowly trickle away. It doesn't mean that the synthesis is that you're becoming one thing. You're still different, but you become united in that difference. And so he sees dialogical pedagogy as an existential urgency. No pedagogy which is truly liberating can remain distant from the oppressed by treating them as unfortunates and by presenting them for their own emulation models from among the oppressors. This is a very powerful statement. The oppressed must be their own example in the struggle for their redemption. Right? That it's not good enough to recognize that you're oppressed. You have to be the authors of your liberation. And yet the oppressors who authentically commit themselves to the people who want to help liberate people from this oppression must also re-examine themselves constantly. You're all part of a dialectic. And when I say dialectic, it should be, I know that this is a fairly opaque philosophical term. A good way to think about it is a dialectic, historically, is sort of like when you're hungry, right? Then you eat and then you're satisfied. A dialectic is that sees sort of life as living between being satisfied and being hungry, right? If you're not one, then you're the other. That it's a condition that you can't I can't liberate myself from hunger. I can't liberate myself from being satisfied. But it's being conscious that there is this relationship to the two that is necessary for my existential condition. What he's suggesting is that the oppressed dialectic works similarly, and that the liberation comes in terms of a recognition, because we can't imagine a world without it, because we've never had a world without it. And so that creates problems. But if you're constantly re-examining yourself and you're constantly thinking about your own and other self-determination, he believes that there can be some liberative moment. I'm going to move to the final part. Rosa Luxemburg, those who do not move do not notice their chains. And I think David Bohm is the best exemplar of this quote. David Bohm, he's not as widely known, but he was a physicist involved in all sorts of experimentations, both in natural sciences and in psychology and philosophy. And he became obsessed with dialogue as a liberative force. And so for him, dialogue was essentially a process of shared thinking in which a valuable form of relationship might emerge. So everything that we've talked about up until now, he agreed with in terms of the sacrifice of self, but he's going to build dialogical possibilities out of it, that there is something shared collectively we as human organisms can do in a dialogical space that he wants to pursue or to learn. He believed that dialogue could help people understand the often incoherent ways in which we think, helping us address the root causes of a range of contemporary problems. So it's important to note, right, that he is a scientist. He is interested in solving problems and understanding the world empirically. And so dialogue for him is going to take on that character. And so this is a quote from his book on dialogue. Sometimes people feel a sense of dialogue within their families. But a family is generally a hierarchy organized on the principle of authority that is contrary to dialogue. The family is a very authoritative structure based on obligation and that sort of thing. It has its value, but it is a structure within which it might be difficult to get dialogue going. In general, it is difficult, though, because there is no place in the dialogue for the principle of authority and hierarchy. We want to be free of hierarchy and authority as we move. So a good question might be, well, does he want to abolish the family? Is he Friedrich Engels? The answer is no. He's not suggesting that we abolish the family. What he's saying is that we, like Freire, we need to become cognizant of the authoritative structures in our everyday life in order to analyze them. And for him, he's going to see this type of self-sacrifice as having some problem-solving orientation. So for Bohm, we need to resist our inclination to become reified in our ideas and beliefs. So for Bohm, it's unnecessary to believe in things like religion, nationalism, the sort of narratives that make up our everyday life. He doesn't think that they're necessarily bad things, but he doesn't want us to constantly keep going back to them. In a sense of ownership too, right? That it's mine, it's my tradition, it's my belief. We need to develop the discipline to suspend our thought and emotional processes when encountering moments of difference. So rather than become defensive when someone shares an idea that's different than yours, he wants us to develop a discipline that allows us to ask better clarifying questions. We need to learn to suspend our judgments and reactions. So he's trying to teach us to be different people and how we engage others. Because as we looked at earlier, if everything in the world is taught and conditioned, it's okay to suspend our judgments and reactions, because for Bohm, he's saying they're not necessarily our own, right? Like we don't have to do these things. We don't have to feel this way. We can still have tradition, we can still have identity, but we don't have to react the way that we do. And suspension is not easily grasped because the activity is both unfamiliar and subtle. Suspension involves exposing your reaction, impulses, feelings, and opinions in such a way that can be seen and felt and also be reflected back by others in the group. And so now he's talking about a dialogical group, and this is where it becomes practical. So if I'm angry and I explain where that anger might be coming from, I don't do it angrily. I explain how that operates, and we as a group then analyze it together. Almost like group therapy. It does not mean repressing or suppressing or even postponing. It simply means giving them your serious attention, that the structures can be noticed while they are actually taking place, right? So when you're angry, sometimes you say things that you might not mean, or you don't even know where it came from, right? Like in an argument, you're like, you immediately apologize. I don't know where that came from. In a dialogical group, what he's suggesting, well, let's analyze that. Like, I wonder where that came, rather than looking at the person. Let's see how we can transcend these emotive responses. Suspension may permit you to begin to see the deeper meanings underlying your thought process, and to sense the often incoherent structure of any emotion that you might otherwise carry out automatically. So he's asking all of us to suspend who we are for the sake of other people in a practical way, because what he's going to do is he's going to talk about these dialogue groups. So this is the practical part. What does he want? What does he see? So he'll take a group of, and he did this for years. He took a group of around 20 people seated in a circle for around 2 hours to engage in a free-flowing conversation in which all try hard to suspend their assumptions and listen to each other with open minds. Easier said than done. But what he didn't want, it was sort of a contrived setting where people were answering questions. For example, the ICJS, we do things like a little bit differently. We may send out a questionnaire asking people to share their views, and that we discuss those views in an anonymous way, and yet everyone in the room knows that those views belong to someone. So we can divorce the ideas from the people, but the emotions are still important in an interreligious setting, because it is important to understand why we feel vulnerable, scared, angry, upset, right? That there is more morals and ethics at stake that challenge our consciousness. But for Bohm, he wants to analyze all of it. And he wants to pay attention to these thought processes, including feelings and reactions. That's the central piece for him. Not whether or not they're true, but where do they come from? How do we understand why we do these things? And so then it becomes a collaborative. We learn together how these reactions can be destructive and creative, because he wants people to start thinking together. And this is where Bohm is going to use dialogue to actually assert a problem-solving initiative, both politically and in terms of society, and that he thinks that people think better when they think together. When ideas flow between people and there's no ownership of the idea, and that people can just go to their organic dialogical selves, we can solve problems because no longer our identities are getting in the way of it. So I went through that pretty quickly, but it's a way to give you a template as to what's out there. In terms of the parting thoughts, let me stop to share. We have a few minutes. I'm just looking at the questions. So Ferrari wrote. So the question was, when did Ferrari write? So he's second half of the 20th century, and so the reason why I put these people together is that when we think of liberation and dialogue, at least in these settings, is that that dialogue opens up numerous possibilities with us, both with people that we trust and people that we don't. And that requires an extraordinary amount of trust in the humanity of the other person. And that's what may make some of these thinkers utopian, right? That to be vulnerable with someone and to know that that person might weaponize my vulnerability against me is enough to not make me want to engage dialogically. And we know that that's a reality. And so what these thinkers are doing are trying to condition us to resist that impulse. That vulnerability is good, questioning ourselves is good, and that dialogue is essentially, like I said in the previous class, is the essential thing that makes us human beings, and that connects us. And all of those other things are commentary, if I'm going to be speaking Jewishly about it.